Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to resilience for trauma-informed professionals for juvenile probation officers. This webinar is being brought to you by the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, which is a training and technical assistance center affiliated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, with funding through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based, trauma-informed services for youth who are at risk for justice system involvement or in the justice system. In addition to supporting youth, the CTRJJ also supports parents and caregivers. Consistent with this mission, the CTRJJ also emphasizes the importance of a trauma-informed workforce and equipping juvenile justice professionals with the skills necessary to carry out this critical work. One thing to note is at the end of the presentation today, you'll be provided an access point to a downloadable certificate. The certificate does not provide CE credit, but can be used internally within your system to acknowledge your participation and professional development. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. My name is Patricia Carrig, and I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah and a faculty member of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. My research is focused on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescent justice involvement and to resilience. Through the CTRJJ, I've contributed to efforts to develop and disseminate evidence-based, trauma-informed practices in ways that protect staff from the effects of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. This next slide provides an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we'll define secondary traumatic stress and talk about going beyond self-care to take a resilience-focused approach. I'll then introduce you to some of the tools in the Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals toolkit, and we'll also do a skill-building exercise together. But I want to start out today with a story that explains how I came to this work. Several years ago, as part of my work with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, I was involved in doing trainings with the very first edition of a curriculum called Think Trauma. And at the time, the curriculum was focused very much on increasing awareness of trauma amongst staff and included some very graphic case examples. And one of those trainings was with a group of probation officers in Provo, Utah. And at the end of the session, a gentleman who'd been sitting very quietly throughout raised his hand and said, "You've convinced me that it's important for us to know if the youth we work with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do this work." And I was surprised and asked him to tell me more about what he was thinking. And he said, "Because if a youth told me any of these terrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought, of course, that makes perfect sense. You're trained as a probation officer. You haven't been trained in how to respond helpfully to a youth's trauma disclosures. And perhaps even more, you haven't been trained in how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that can arise when we hear about other people's traumas. So I thought to myself that something more was needed, and I set out on a journey of discovery to find out all I could about what we know about the effects of exposure to others' traumas and what helps us in the aftermath. I found a lot of wonderful resources, which I'll share with you today, but I also identified some gaps that I'll talk about as well. So who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to other people's traumas? Well, it turns out essentially all of us, including probation officers, judges, detention staff, attorneys, forensic evaluators, mental health providers, and even researchers who study topics related to violence and trauma. There's some unique ways in which exposures occur for each of these professions, but there's some common themes that have come up in the recent listening sessions I've been conducting. And these include reading trauma-filled case histories, doing trauma history screenings, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, sometimes repeatedly, interacting with distressed youth and family members, listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. And in addition, many of the juvenile justice professionals I've been talking to, especially those who work in facilities or who go into clients' homes, these exposures can go beyond hearing stories about things that happened in the past, but more immediate sensory inputs, sights, sounds, scents that tell them in a very visceral and powerful way that something bad has happened. Well, why should we be concerned with exposure to other people's traumas? In fact, exposure to others' traumas has a real impact. As Tim Wires put it so poignantly, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. In fact, exposure to others' traumas is a potential source of trauma for us. It's interesting to note that this wasn't always recognized to be the case. The long-standing definition of trauma in the diagnostic manual is that it includes exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or violence through experiencing it ourselves, witnessing it happening, or learning it's happened to a loved one. And this is what we can call primary trauma exposure. But for the first time, when the diagnostic manual was revised most recently, the definition was expanded to include exposure to the details of someone else's traumatic event. And the definition even goes on to give the example of officers who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse through their work. This we can call secondary traumatic stress, and the effects of it, secondary traumatic stress. So if this is true, addressing STS is a professional competency for those whose work involves exposure to trauma. Beyond personal self-care, that's our own individual responsibility, skills for recognizing, preventing, and responding to STS are crucial tools that we all need in our professional toolkits. But I want to make sure to say, even though I'm talking about STS in the context of a diagnosis, having a reaction to others' traumas is not a sign of pathology. Far from it. It's only human. Post-traumatic stress disorder and secondary traumatic stress come into play only when those reactions cause significant distress or interfere with our ability to function. After all, as Rachel Raymond puts it, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma every day of our work lives and not be affected would be as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. So before we go further, I wanted to talk a bit about the different terms that are used when people talk about this topic. They're sometimes used as though they're interchangeable, but I think each one captures a unique facet of what is a multifaceted construct. One term that we hear often is burnout. Burnout refers to those feelings of emotional exhaustion and ineffectiveness that can come about when we're doing work in which we feel powerless and unappreciated. Burnout certainly can occur in the context of working with trauma, but it's not specific to trauma. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel powerless and unappreciated. Another term that's been used is compassion fatigue. And I think this captures well that sense of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often, and that well is dry. But this is a bit of a problematic term, and I want to explain why I say that. There's a wonderful animated short Brene Brown created to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. In this film, the little fox has climbed down into the pit of despair. Some animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, that looks rough. Hope you feel better soon. But this empathetic bear climbs down into the pit and shares the fox's experience with him. The fox appreciates it. He feels understood and he no longer feels so alone. But if you look, you can now see clouds of despair over both their heads. And I wonder what's going to become now of that poor bear. So if empathy can be defined as sharing another's feeling state, compassion is something different. Compassion refers to seeing that someone is suffering or in trouble and wanting to help. So rather than climbing down into the pit of despair with someone, we might throw down a lifeline to help them up. And further, when we do this in the context of a mutually supportive team, we don't need to do it alone. We're all helping to lift each other up. So I think a more accurate label for this experience is empathy fatigue. And another term that's commonly used is vicarious trauma. And this captures well the changes in our own thoughts and feelings that can come about when we've connected on an emotional level to someone who's experienced trauma. And I also think this is important to consider because it's linked to another construct called moral injury. Moral injury has been defined as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or merely learning about acts that violate our own deeply held moral beliefs. Moral injury was first identified in military personnel who came home from war deeply troubled by things they had seen or things they had done. But recently, this construct has been expanded to a wide variety of populations, including in my lab, youth in the juvenile justice system and youth in gangs. We've found this concept makes so much sense to them, and they have no difficulty identifying things that trouble them, that they themselves have done, that they've stood by and allowed to happen, or that they've witnessed. But by far the most impactful dimension of moral injury we have found is betrayal. When someone you should have been able to turn to for protection and care did something you feel is deeply wrong. So now we come to the last term, secondary traumatic stress, which in its formal sense can include any of the symptoms associated with PTSD, including intrusive thoughts and images, strong motivation to avoid reminders, changes in our mood and thoughts, and feelings of being keyed up and hypervigilant. And because I think of STS as being at the deep end of the continuum and including the dimensions of the other constructs, it's the term that I've been using. Another reason why these terms are helpful to keep in mind is there also can be the opposite. Just as there can be compassion, or more accurately, empathy fatigue, there's also the possibility of compassion satisfaction, of gaining positive feelings from being competent at our work, having good relationships with our coworkers, and knowing that our work makes a meaningful difference. And similarly, just as we might experience vicarious trauma, we also might experience vicarious resilience when we witness another overcoming their trauma. Research also tells us a bit about the risk and protective factors for STS. One major risk is working in an isolative work environment, whereas connection with our coworkers is protective. The sheer volume of trauma exposure increases the risk, whereas seeking support and debriefing in helpful ways can be protective. Some research shows that those with high levels of empathy are more vulnerable, but compassion satisfaction can lower the risk. Importantly, our own shame about having STS reactions increases their negative impact, whereas openness and acknowledgement can be helpful. Also, coming into this work with our own histories of trauma and adversity can increase the risk of STS, but this isn't absolute. Having achieved resolution and made meaning of those experiences can erase that risk. Finally, the sheer fact that people go into this work feeling unprepared to encounter STS can increase the risk, whereas knowing we have the necessary tools in our toolbox can be protective. Well, what does STS look like? It depends on who you ask. But one wonderful resource I found was a book by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky called Trauma Stewardship, in which she points out that if we're going to be working with traumatized individuals, we need to not only be good stewards or caretakers of their well-being, but of our own. And in this book, she uses a lot of gentle humor to talk about hard things, including using some evocative cartoons. So what might those teach us about STS? One potential sign is feelings of helplessness and low self-efficacy. And even though I think this is a funny cartoon, I'm going to have a disclaimer about it later today. Another sign is working hard, but feeling like we're never doing enough, that we're just howling at the moon. Hypervigilance, that feeling of being always on, barking at everything. Loss of pleasure in life as workplace stress takes over our lives. And a big one is cynicism, when people find they've lost their sense of purpose and meaning in the work they do. Or for others, it's the opposite of feeling trapped by their own indispensability, that they're the only ones who can put out this forest fire. Although these cartoons are humorous, they're also poignant because they're used to illustrate actual quotes by real people. So here's an animal rescue worker who talks about, every time I save a life, the only thing I can think about is the lives I've failed to save. And this feels like a personal failure. Here, a community organizer talks about life simply consisting of going to work, coming home, and going round and round the dial. And here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not even being able to enjoy looking at a friend's wedding photos without the intrusive thought coming into her mind, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. Other potential signs of STS are physical exhaustion, sleep difficulties, headaches and muscle pains, and even getting sick more often as stress affects our immune system. The effects can be seen in our behavior, including increased substance use or other addictive behaviors, whether those are shopping, gambling, social media, or even workaholism. Anger and irritability, socially isolating, and what's called the silencing response, shutting others down in a way that communicates that we're exhausted and our mental and emotional door is closed. The signs also may be psychological, including emotional exhaustion, feelings of ineffectiveness, low mood, increased cynicism, loss of pleasure in life. We may experience changes in our worldview that come about through moral injury and any of the symptoms associated with PTSD. And here there are also important individual differences. Some people will report an increased sensitivity to anything that reminds them of what they're exposed to at work, whereas others will report becoming numb. And then there are signs and symptoms that affect our professional lives, including that overburdened sense of responsibility versus the opposite of avoiding work, resenting the demands, and dreading the workday. People may experience difficulty making decisions and overall a sense of difficulty separating their work and personal lives. And although I've talked about these as separate domains, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. But what about those who work in the juvenile justice system? I mentioned earlier the listening sessions I've been holding, and I wanted to share some of the highlights with you. So, what have probation officers told me about STS? They've described increased levels of frustration, zapped energy, negative mood, poor sleep, withdrawing and investing less of themselves in their work, and actively entertaining the idea of leaving the profession. Many have said that they're able to function fine while they're at work. They're consummate professionals, but the strain begins to show when they get home. One shared that he wasn't even aware he'd been affected by STS until his spouse pointed out how impatient he'd become with his family and how he shut them down anytime anyone expressed an emotion. And I thought, my gosh, you're right. This job has changed me. Well, does no one know about this? In fact, far from it. I know this is a terribly busy slide with small font, but it's just to illustrate how many studies I found when I looked into the literature. The fact that probation officers are affected by STS is a well-known and widely recognized phenomenon. In fact, recently, a judicial system in Australia was found liable for failing to provide a safe work environment by not protecting staff from the negative effects of vicarious trauma. The court determined that there was a duty of care where exposure to trauma is an unavoidable part of the work of its employees. So clearly, STS is a prevalent and concerning phenomenon. What can we do to counter the effects? Well, when we turn to the literature, what we find almost universally is a recommendation to engage in self-care. You can see here a veritable sea of self-care. There are a number of measures that have been developed that can help us identify and track our use of self-care strategies, including taking time off when it's granted, engaging in relaxing activities, getting physical exercise, eating well, and connecting with our spiritual and social supports. These are all good things to do, and certainly they can enhance our overall well-being. But what happens in the real world when stressed people come home from work at the end of a hard day? Too often, the self-soothing strategies that are readily available are not the ones that are most helpful in the long run. But even more than that, there's some evidence that self-care has limits. One particularly striking study followed a group of trauma professionals and found that participating in trainings focused on self-care did not increase the amount of time they spent in self-care activities. That's perhaps not surprising. We don't always do the things we know we're supposed to do. But more than that, the researchers found that the amount of time people spent in self-care was not associated with lower STS. Well, why might that be so? Well, one possibility is that many suggested self-care activities are things we can only do at home at the end of the day. So they're taking place long after secondary exposure, and they're divorced from our workplace. Instead, we need strategies that we can use in the moment, here and now, when we're affected by STS. And we need strategies that are integrated with our workplaces. If STS arising from our work is not solely our individual responsibility, we need a workplace culture that recognizes STS and provides us with an ecology of mutual support. Another potential limitation to self-care is that it doesn't always take into account individual differences, especially those related to our cultural backgrounds. Culture impacts the beliefs we have about what is trauma and how it affects us, our worldviews regarding what we can and cannot control, how we make sense of our experiences, and importantly, the processes we believe will be healing. This was brought home to me by one of my students who emigrated to the US from Cuba and told me that when she looked at these self-care measures, they didn't speak to her at all. That if she wanted to regenerate in the aftermath of exposure to STS, she wouldn't treat herself to a spa day or some such thing, but rather she would cook up a big feast and invite all her neighbors and friends to share it with her. And that would be restorative for her. So if self-care is not necessarily the solution, what would be an alternative approach? One alternative is to think in terms of resilience. But what do we mean by that? When researchers first started studying resilience, they wrote about it as though there were some people who were magically armor-plated. They could walk through fire without getting burned. They were impervious to all adversity. But subsequent research showed that this was not true, that resilient people are affected by their experiences. And that's just as well, because a suit of armor would be a hot and heavy thing to have to wear around. I also don't think resilience is akin to wearing a psychological hazmat suit that insulates us from the pathogens around us. In fact, having emotions about our work is only human. And in fact, emotions are a valuable tool. They tell us when there's something we need to pay attention to. So what then is resilience? Resilience means adapting in the face of challenges, but resilient people are affected by their experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And resilience is not just a matter of our own personalities or true grit. Resilience isn't a trait, but rather a process that takes place in the interaction between ourselves and our environments. And it's made up of strengths and protective factors in multiple domains. One is the emotional domain, our capacity to be aware of our emotions, to regulate them, and to cope with them. Another is the cognitive domain, our capacity to make meaning of our experiences and to retain our sense of purpose, to be mindful of our spiritual and cultural values. And a third domain is the interpersonal, our capacity to have compassion for others as well as ourselves, and to stay connected to our social supports and sense of community. So in the face of all the challenges STS puts in our path, what enables us to be resilient? I would say that just like exposure to primary trauma, secondary traumatic stress dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, perhaps even morally, and causes us to experience as though it's happening in the present, something that has happened in the past. So, if this is true, the strategies that will protect us will be those that help to reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, dispel unhelpful interpretations, and reconnect us to our strengths, our sources of support, and our values. So, with this resilience framework in mind, I developed a curriculum called Resilience for Trauma Informed Professionals. And I've written an article that describes the underlying principles. But I think a better way of introducing you to RTIP is to describe how it's organized around each of the stages of our encounters with trauma-related material. And I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail in a bit. But first, are there ways we can prevent unnecessary exposures? And second, what can we do prior to exposure to increase our resilience? Third, what can we do during exposures in the here and now? And then what can we do after exposures to monitor our well-being and recover our balance? So I want to share examples of each of these steps from the workbook that accompanies the training. First, are there ways we can prevent unnecessary exposures? One question to consider is, what is our purpose when we gather detailed trauma histories? What are we going to do with that information? If our purpose is to identify which youth are affected by post-traumatic stress and in need of trauma-informed services, maybe the more important information to gather is what post-traumatic symptoms they're experiencing in the present, rather than asking questions that elicit graphic details about what has happened in the past. An example of a tool designed to do this is the Triggers and Coping Strategies or Safety Plan. And the first page of this tool invites youth to identify the situations that trigger them or push their buttons. And these will be very different for different youth. For example, for some youth, feeling abandoned and left alone is triggering, whereas for others, it's feeling crowded and intruded upon. The second page of the tool invites youth to identify the ways in which they'd show that they had been triggered. Again, this will be different for different youth. Some will become loud and angry, whereas others will become very, very quiet. The third page invites youth to identify strategies that would be helpful to them if they became triggered, whether that's for someone to come into their space and talk with them, or whether it's to have time on their own. We also talk about ways we can protect our colleagues and one another. STS can be contagious. So when we seek support and debrief after we've heard a horrible story, we might inadvertently be passing on the trauma to the person we're debriefing with. So we talk about strategies for debriefing that lessen the impact on others and ensure that they're ready for what we share. And if I have time at the end, I'll come back and describe this in more detail. We also talk about some of the things that can keep us stuck in a trauma story, even after we've had a chance to debrief. And here we focus on the role of appraisals or interpretations. These are the meanings that we make, the event, what it means about ourselves, other people, or the world around us. These appraisals are important because they can impact our emotions, behavior, and how we relate to others. And importantly, they're open to change. At the next stage of our encounter with STS, we talk about the tools we need to have ready in our toolboxes in the here and now. So, for example, if you remember the probation officer who told me his concern was that if a youth disclosed a trauma to him, he wouldn't know what to say. One of the worksheets in the workbook takes us through just that scenario. When a youth discloses trauma, what is helpful to do and say, and what is not helpful? Another worksheet takes us through a more challenging scenario. Should someone become triggered and have a full-blown post-traumatic reaction in our presence? What would we do and what would we say? And throughout the curriculum, we pay attention to individual differences. The strategies that are helpful for one person won't necessarily be helpful for others. What we strive for is to not have just one single-use tool in our toolbox, but a Swiss Army knife that is readily adaptable. And then we talk about the strategies that we can use to recover our balance in the aftermath of STS exposure. But one important skill that comes into play here is the ability to recognize when we are affected by STS. There are some great ways of doing that, including the Professional Quality of Life Scale, which is freely available online and lets us do a quick self-check of our level of burnout, STS, and compassion satisfaction. But a limit of the ProQual is that the indicators of STS it assesses might not be yours, and they might not be mine. Again, here's the theme of individual differences. So here we're going to pause and do a deeper dive and engage in a skill building exercise. In fact, we can develop our own individualized early warning system based on our own unique reactions when we're exposed to STS. So let's take a closer look at what we call the dosimeter. What's a dosimeter? It's the little meter an X-ray tech wears to tell them if they've been exposed to a toxic dose of X-rays. So the first thing the dosimeter asks us to do is to think about what we're like when we're in our green zone, when we're calm and at our best, relaxed, unstressed, and thinking clearly. Then what are we like when we're in our yellow zone and just beginning to be affected by STS? What are those first signs that tell us we'd benefit from taking a step back to recover our balance? And then what are we like when we're in our red zone and STS has completely gotten the better of us? It's also important to track the signs that you show at work versus the signs that you bring home, as those might be very different. I mentioned before that probation officers often told me that they're able to be very professional, effective during the workday, but it's when they go home that the effects begin to show. Another question I ask participants in my trainings is, who's the best source of information to complete your dosimeter? And often their first thought is, well, me, myself. And that might be true, but it's also possible that there are those close to us who notice things that we're not aware of. For example, one of my colleagues told me she noticed one of my early warning signs was that I no longer laughed at her jokes. I was completely unaware of that. I thought she just wasn't being very funny. So in addition to having somebody who might pick up on things that you're not aware of, another advantage to completing your dosimeter in collaboration with someone you trust is they can become an accountability buddy who can help you monitor and give you a nudge if you're showing signs of stress that you aren't tuned into. So the dosimeter becomes part of a larger STS protection toolkit that is the ultimate goal and outcome of this process. The personal protection toolkit we each develop incorporates the identification of our warning signs, a plan for regular check-ins to monitor our dose, strategies we've identified that we will use and will work for us to help maintain our balance in anticipation of STS exposure, during exposures, and after exposures. And then we include strategies we can employ in the longer term to bolster our resilience and nurture our compassion satisfaction. We also don't forget the lessons of that study I mentioned that showed attending trainings in self-care did not increase the amount of time that people spent in self-care. So we talk about some of the things that can get in the way of employing these STS protection tools. For example, these strategies might feel self-indulgent or even selfish, but it's important to consider that we'll do our best work and be most helpful to others when we are calm, clear thinking, and helpful. As Sackmitter wrote, we have an obligation to our clients as well as to ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. Or as Robin Tenner put it, even more succinctly, STS hurts you and hurts your family. We also talk about the importance of practicing what we preach. To just read about these skills or sit through trainings without putting them into practice is, as Francoise Mathieu said, like trying to fix a flat tire by reading your car's owner's manual. Above all, though, we emphasize that addressing STS requires a multi-pronged effort. Yes, there are professional tools we can each develop, and there's also a personal investment we can all make to nurture our own resilience and engage in self-compassion, and yes, I'll even say self-care. But a crucial piece of the puzzle is the investment organizations can make to acknowledge that STS is an occupational hazard, to reduce risks when possible, and to respond to STS-affected staff. So this brings us back to the strategies that can assist us prior to exposure to STS. I think of organizational strategies as coming into play at 3 levels. First is prevention, such as by maintaining a climate of mutual support and reducing risks whenever possible. Then there's ongoing monitoring of staff well-being. And then having supports in place to respond to STS-affected staff, including STS-informed supervision and access to resources and referrals to external supports when needed. Because, after all, despite the humor in this cartoon, seeking therapy is an act of high self-efficacy. There's some very rich resources available for STS-informed systems from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, including an organizational assessment tool to allow organizations to do a self-check on how well they are protecting and responding to staff. There's also a framework that describes the competencies that will help supervisors to be effective in supporting STS-affected staff, including a handy self-rating skill. And then on this next slide, I've shared some of my favorite resources on resilience and recovery from STS. And there are also some terrific resources that are specific to the juvenile justice community. All right. On that note, I will thank you for attending this webinar. And here's my contact information for anyone who would like that. Just a couple of other things to note. This is the first of a series of webinars, each of them targeted toward a specific role in the juvenile justice system. So the next webinar will be in June for juvenile defense attorneys. This next slide provides you with a QR code that will give you access to resources on the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice website. And then as a reminder, well, you don't need the reminder if you're watching this, you have accessed this through the CRTRJJ YouTube channel. And then this slide provides you with information for accessing the certificate of participation. There's a URL that you can put into your browser, and you can take a photo of this if needed. And note that the password for access is R-TIP. All right. On that note, I will end. Thank you very much.